Hello everyone, I am Dark Files. Tonight, I've prepared chilling stories designed to immerse you in darkness. Whether you're here to unwind, drift off to sleep, or simply feel that creeping sense of dread, relax, and let the terror begin. The drive up to the cabin had been uneventful, just the five of us packed into Dylan's beat-up SUV, our bags crammed into the back, the winding road stretching endlessly through the dense forest. We had been planning this trip for weeks, a long weekend away from everything, just us, the woods, and an isolated cabin with no responsibilities, no school, no work, no stress. The rental cabin was perfect, 2 floors, a wraparound porch, and a stone fireplace. It sat nestled deep in the trees, surrounded by thick forest on every side. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of other people for miles, except for the one next door. The owner had mentioned it briefly when Dylan picked up the keys. The cabin next to yours. It's been abandoned for years, the man had said, waving his hand dismissively. No one goes in or out. Place is falling apart. Just don't go poking around. Yeah, we hadn't thought much of it at the time. That first night, everything felt normal. We grilled outside, drank too much, played cards until we could barely keep our eyes open. The woods were eerily quiet, but that only made the night feel more peaceful. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel wrong. It was nearly midnight when I first noticed it. I had stepped out onto the porch for some air, letting the cool breeze sober me up. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering against one another. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the ground. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the window of the abandoned cabin. There was someone standing there. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the angle, the reflection of the moonlight against the glass. But as I looked closer, my stomach tightened. The figure was tall, standing completely still, just behind the dirty pane of glass, watching. My breath hitched, my body locking up. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Then Dylan's voice snapped me out of it. "Hey man, you good?" I turned sharply, my heart still hammering in my chest. Dylan stood in the doorway, beer in hand, his expression slightly amused. I glanced back at the window. The figure was gone. I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "Just thought I saw something." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Dude, if you're already seeing ghosts, you need to lay off the whiskey." I forced a chuckle, shaking my head. Yeah, let's get back inside." I followed him in, trying to ignore the uneasy feelings settling deep in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that window, and the thing standing inside it. The next morning, I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. Maybe the glass was warped, making it look like something had been there when it hadn't. But even as we ate breakfast on the porch, my eyes kept drifting back to that cabin. It looked as empty as ever. The paint on the walls was peeling. The wooden steps leading up to the door were cracked and broken. Weeds and vines crept along the edges of the foundation, swallowing the place up like the forest was trying to reclaim it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. By midday, I wasn't the only one who noticed something felt off. "Does anyone else feel like they're being watched?" Olivia asked, rubbing her arms as she sat on the porch railing. Dylan snorted. "Are you seriously getting freaked out? It's just the woods. It's supposed to feel empty." Olivia rolled her eyes. "I'm not talking about that. I mean, I keep feeling like..." She paused, frowning. "Like there's someone just outside my vision. Like you know when you feel someone looking at you." A weird silence settled over us. I hadn't told them about what I'd seen last night, but I suddenly felt a cold pit of dread in my stomach. Had Olivia seen something too? "I mean, I did hear something weird last night," Jake said, stretching his arms over his head. "Like footsteps outside, around 2 or 3 in the morning. I figured it was just an animal." "Footsteps?" I asked, my voice coming out too tight. Jake nodded, chewing his lip. "Yeah, like not close to the cabin, but not too far either." Thought I was imagining it. but it sounded kinda slow. He shrugged, like someone taking their time. No one spoke after that. It was just a weird vibe, we told ourselves. The isolation getting to us. It was easy to freak yourself out when you were surrounded by endless trees and silence. But I knew it wasn't just in our heads, because later that night, we saw it. We had been sitting around the fireplace, half drunk and swapping stories. The warmth from the fire, making the room cozy despite the unease, still lingering in the air. Then Sarah suddenly went rigid, her breath hitching, her eyes locked onto the window behind me. I didn't even have to turn around. I already knew what she was seeing. A shape, a figure standing in the window of the abandoned cabin, watching. Jake cursed under his breath. What the? But as soon as I turned, it was gone. The empty window stared back at us, the dirty glass reflecting nothing but the trees behind it. Tell me you saw that, Sarah whispered, her face pale. I saw it, Jake muttered. Dylan stood abruptly. That's it. Someone's messing with us. He grabbed a flashlight and started toward the door. Dylan, wait, I started, but he was already stepping outside. The cold air hit me as I followed him onto the porch. The others were right behind me, huddled together as Dylan stormed toward the cabin next door. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Dylan marched right up the steps, the wood creaking loudly beneath his weight. He hesitated only for a second, before gripping the doorknob. It turned easily. The door swung open with a soft click. The cabin was pitch black inside. Dylan lifted his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Empty. No furniture. No signs of life. Just dust-covered floors and walls. A single broken chair in the center of the room. But the air inside was wrong. Stale. Heavy. And the worst part, there were footprints in the dust, leading from the window to the door. And then, nothing. Like whoever had been inside had just vanished. Dylan took a slow step backward. Yeah, screw this. We all turned and hurried back to our cabin, locking the door behind us. No one slept that night, and we weren't sure if we'd make it to morning. The hours dragged on, each second stretching longer than the last. None of us spoke. None of us even dared to move too far from one another. The fire crackled weakly in the living room, but its warmth did nothing to chase away the cold weight of fear pressing against us. Every so often, one of us would glance at the window. None of us wanted to, but it was impossible not to. We were waiting for it to come back. Midnight came and went. The forest outside was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sounds of animals scurrying through the brush, just an unnatural stillness, like the entire world was holding its breath. Then around 2 a.m., the scratching started. It was soft at first, barely audible over the fire, a slow, deliberate scrape against the wood. I felt my stomach twist as my hands clenched into fists. It was outside. Sarah gasped quietly, her breath hitching. Jake was gripping the armrest of his chair, so hard his knuckles had gone white. Olivia had a hand over her mouth. The scratching moved. It slid from the wall near the door to the window. I turned my head slowly, my body frozen with fear. The blinds were shut, the thick fabric blocking out whatever was on the other side. But I could feel it, standing just beyond the glass, watching us. Dylan, who had been the loudest, most confident of us all, sat stiffly on the couch, his jaw locked tight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the window, like he was willing it not to move. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 taps, steady and calm. I felt a chill creep down my spine. No one moved. No one breathed. Another knock. Then, a voice. Let me in. The words slithered through the door, soft and breathy. But the voice didn't belong to any of us. It was wrong, flat, empty, like it was mimicking speech without understanding it. I saw Dylan's Adam's apple bob. As he swallowed hard, Sarah let out a shaky whisper. No one answered it. We sat in terrified silence. The fire crackled, the shadows shifting along the walls. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately. Jake sucked in a sharp breath, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His eyes locked onto the door. The knob rattled once, twice. Then, it stopped. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then a slow, shuffling sound moved away from the door, back toward the abandoned cabin. I didn't dare look out the window. None of us slept. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were already throwing our bags into the car. None of us said a word. We just wanted to leave. The drive back was silent. No music, no conversation, just the sound of the tires on the empty road. It wasn't until we reached the first gas station miles away that Dylan finally spoke. "We're never talking about this again." No one argued. We didn't look up the history of that cabin. We didn't ask the owner about what had happened there, and we never ever went back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that window, and the thing that stood behind it, watching, waiting, smiling without a face. The last time I had seen Michael, we were 13 years old, riding our bikes down the old dirt road that led away from his house, kicking up dust as we raced toward the lake at the edge of town. We had been inseparable back then, but life happened. My family moved, and we lost touch. 15 years passed before I even thought about looking him up again. I wasn't sure what made me do it. Nostalgia, maybe, or maybe it was the unease I had been feeling lately. The gnawing sense that something in my life had gone wrong without me even realizing it. When I finally found Michael's name online, it was like opening a door I had forgotten existed. His number was listed under his parents' landline, the same house I had spent so many childhood summers in. I called, expecting the line to be disconnected, but someone answered, a woman's voice. "Hello." My heart skipped a beat. Hi, I'm looking for Michael. "Is this Mrs. Turner?" A pause. Then the woman spoke again. "Yes, who is this?" I hesitated. "It's Jacob. Jacob Reynolds, Michael's old friend. We used to hang out all the time when we were kids." Another silence. Then, "Oh, Jacob, of course. It's been so long." There was something off about her voice. It was polite, warm even, but forced, like she was struggling to remember. "Yeah," I said slowly. "A long time. You should come by," she said suddenly. "I'm sure Michael would love to see you." It wasn't exactly the reaction I had expected. There was something strange about how quickly she invited me over, but I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut. Maybe they were just surprised to hear from me after so long. The next morning, I made the drive out to my hometown, and the moment I turned onto Michael's road, something felt wrong. It looked exactly the same. The same cracked pavement, the same gnarled oak trees lining the street. Even Michael's house, white with blue shutters, the big front porch where we used to sit and eat popsicles, looked untouched by time. But something was missing. I just couldn't figure out what. I parked in the driveway, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The house stood still, eerily quiet. No movement behind the windows. It was like stepping into a frozen memory. Then the front door creaked open. Michael's mother stepped out onto the porch, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jacob," she said warmly, "you found us." I forced a smile. "Yeah, it's good to see you, Mrs. Turner." She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place me. Then she stepped aside. "Come in, dear." I hesitated, that strange unease twisting deeper in my stomach. But I stepped inside anyway, and the moment the door shut behind me, I knew I had made a mistake. The moment I stepped inside, the air in the house felt wrong. Not just old, not just stale, wrong. The living room was exactly as I remembered. The same brown leather couch, the same wooden coffee table, even the same framed family photos lining the walls. It was like no time had passed at all. And yet, something was off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The air was too still. There was no hum of a fridge, no creaking of old pipes, no distant ticking of a clock, no sound at all. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Sit, Mrs. Turner," said, gesturing toward the couch. I hesitated but forced a smile. "Thanks." I sat down, the leather feeling too cold against my skin. My fingers drummed against my knee as I glanced toward the staircase. "Is Michael here?" Mrs. Turner smiled. "Of course. He'll be down in a moment." I nodded. but something in her tone made my skin prickle. Then I noticed the family photos on the wall. They were wrong. At first glance, they looked normal. Michael, his parents, their golden retriever. But the longer I stared, the more details stood out. The smiles were all the same. Stiff, forced, too many teeth showing. And in every picture, Michael's eyes were slightly off. Not looking at the camera, not looking at his parents, looking somewhere else. My throat tightened. I turned back to Mrs. Turner, who was watching me too closely. "Let me get you some tea," she said suddenly, standing up too quickly. I watched her disappear into the kitchen, her footsteps silent against the floor. I swallowed hard. I should leave. I didn't know why, but every part of me was screaming to get out of this house. Then, from the top of the stairs, a creak. I turned slowly. Michael stood at the top, his hand resting on the banister. I felt my breath catch. He looked exactly the same, not just similar, the same, like he hadn't aged a day since we were kids. His hair was the same length, his face unchanged. Even his clothes, a hoodie and jeans, looked familiar, too familiar. A slow smile spread across his face. "Jacob," he said. His voice was normal, casual, friendly, but his eyes, they were empty, a hollow, soulless black. I shot to my feet, my heart pounding. Michael's smile didn't waver. "What's wrong?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I needed to leave. Now, I turned toward the door, my pulse hammering. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The lock was gone. There was no keyhole, no latch, just smooth wood. I turned back, panic rising in my chest. Mrs. Turner stood in the kitchen doorway now, watching me. Her smile was too wide. Michael took a step down the stairs. "Stay a while, Jacob," he murmured. "We have so much to catch up on." The walls around me shifted, the house seeming to close in, suffocating. The road outside, the one I had driven in on, it wasn't there anymore, just endless trees. And I realized, with a deep sinking horror, I had made a terrible mistake. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away from the door, my fingers still pressing uselessly against the smooth, keyless wood. There was no way out. Michael was coming down the stairs now, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto mine. They weren't human eyes. They were black voids, empty and vast, like staring into something endless and hungry. "Jacob," he said again, that same hollow smile stretching across his face. "Why are you trying to leave? You just got here." Mrs. Turner moved closer, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, her head tilting just slightly. "You used to love it here," she said softly. "Don't you remember?" I took a shaky step backward. My voice came out dry, barely more than a whisper. My mind raced. Think. Something was wrong with this house, with them. This wasn't real, or at least, it wasn't right. I glanced toward the windows. The trees outside were different now, closer. The branches twisted unnaturally, stretching toward the house like gnarled fingers. The sky beyond them was wrong. The colors muted, the light faded. I was somewhere else, not home, not Earth. "Sit," Michael said, his voice gentle, but there was something underneath it, something dark, something eager. My stomach turned. I forced my voice to work. "I need to go," I croaked. Michael chuckled, and when he did, the whole house seemed to laugh with him. The floorboards creaked under my feet. The walls groaned. Something shifted above me, like the whole place was breathing. Mrs. Turner smiled wider. "But Jacob, you never left." The words hit me like a gut punch. My breath caught. "What?" I whispered. Michael stepped closer. "This is home," he said. "You belong here. You always have." I felt dizzy, the world tilting around me, my thoughts tangled, my memories suddenly blurring. Flashes of childhood, summer days, sitting on this very couch, laughing, playing games with Michael. But the memories felt distant now, like something was rewriting them, like they were changing. I gritted my teeth, shaking my head violently. "No," I muttered. "No, I left. I moved away. I grew up. This isn't real." The smile on Michael's face faltered, just for a second. Then he lunged, I barely had time to react before I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan. I just moved. My shoulder slammed into the nearest window, expecting glass, but there was nothing. The world outside swallowed me whole. I wasn't falling. I was sinking into something dark, something alive. The last thing I heard before the world collapsed around me was Michael's voice, whispering through the void, "You were never supposed to leave." Then everything went black. I hit the ground hard. Not pavement, not dirt, something softer, almost like a dense fog, thick and clinging, wrapping around me like invisible hands. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but it felt thin, weak, like I was breathing in something wrong. When I opened my eyes, the house was gone. The trees surrounded me in every direction, their twisted, gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The air smelled stale, heavy with something damp and rotten. But the worst part, there was no sky, just a vast, colorless expanse above me, stretching endlessly in every direction, like the world itself had forgotten what the sky was supposed to be. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering. "Michael," I called out, my voice swallowed instantly by the dead air. No answer. I turned in a slow circle, my breath hitching. There were no paths, no roads, just endless trees. I had to be dreaming. I had to. But when I looked down, my footprints were pressed into the soft ground. The cold air bit at my skin. The ache in my shoulder from the fall was real. I wasn't asleep. I was somewhere else. And I wasn't alone. A branch cracked in the distance. I turned sharply, my chest tightening. A shadow moved between the trees. Tall. Too tall. Too tall. I took a step back, my throat dry. Then from behind me, a whisper, "You can't leave." I spun around, my heart lurching into my throat. Michael stood there, except it wasn't him. His face was stretched, his skin too smooth, like something trying to wear a person's shape, but not quite understanding how. His eyes, black, empty voids, stared at me with hunger. He smiled, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was no path, no clear way out. But my instinct screamed at me to move. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop. Behind me, the thing that had once been Michael followed. Not running, not chasing, just walking, like it knew I had nowhere to go. My lungs ached, my vision blurred. The trees pressed closer, the ground shifting beneath me like it was breathing. Then I saw it, a door, standing alone in the middle of the woods, tall and wooden, its frame warped like it had been there for centuries. My last chance. I lunged for it, my fingers curling around the handle, and yanked. The door swung open, and I fell. I woke up on the side of the road, the same road I had driven down just hours before. But my car was gone. The sun was rising, the sky washed in soft orange hues, and the town I had grown up in stretched out before me like nothing had happened, like I had never left. I stumbled to my feet, my hands shaking. My phone was still in my pocket. The time read 6:47 a.m. Had it all been a dream? No, because when I looked up, down the road where Michael's house should have been, there was nothing, just trees, no house, no driveway, no sign that anything had ever been there. Michael's house didn't exist, and maybe it never had. Emma and I had only been parents for 6 months, and already we were exhausted beyond belief. Our daughter Lily was beautiful, perfect, but she had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night, babbling to herself, or crying for no reason at all. So when Emma's parents gifted us a high-tech baby monitor, we were relieved. It had a video feed, night vision, and even an audio function that let us hear every sound from Lily's room. It gave us peace of mind, knowing we could check on her without getting up. That night, we put Lily to bed at 8:30 p.m. Same as always. I kissed her soft little forehead, tucked her into her crib, and turned on the monitor, before heading to our own room down the hall. For a while, everything was normal. Emma and I lay in bed watching TV. The baby monitor propped up on my nightstand. The screen showed Lily sleeping peacefully, the soft glow of her nightlight casting warm shadows across the room. At around 2 a.m., something woke me up. A faint noise, soft, almost melodic. I blinked, disoriented, before realizing it was coming from the baby monitor. A lullaby. At first, I thought Emma had gotten up to soothe Lily, but when I turned, she was still beside me, fast asleep. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The lullaby was gentle, almost hypnotic, sung in a whispering voice, but the words, they weren't in English. I leaned closer to the monitor, my pulse quickening. The screen showed Lily's crib. She was awake, sitting up, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the crib bars. She was giggling. My breath caught. A shadow moved near the edge of the screen. I froze. There was no one else in that room, and yet something was singing to my daughter. I reached over, shaking Emma's shoulder. "Emma," I whispered urgently. She groaned, turning toward me. "What?" "Listen," I hissed, pointing at the monitor. Her eyes flickered open, groggy at first. Then, as the singing continued, she shot upright, her breath hitching. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer, because at that moment, Lily looked up, toward the unseen figure near the monitor's edge, and reached out, like she wanted to be picked up. Emma bolted out of bed before I could stop her. She rushed into Lily's room, throwing open the door. The lullaby stopped immediately. I grabbed the monitor, running after her. By the time I reached Lily's crib, Emma was already lifting her into her arms. Her face pale, she turned toward me, her voice shaking. "There's no one here." I stared around the nursery. Empty. The rocking chair in the corner was still. The window was locked. The closet door stood slightly open, revealing nothing but hanging baby clothes. But I knew what I had heard. And worse, when I looked down at the baby monitor in my hands, the screen was frozen, still showing Lily in the crib, still showing the shadow beside her. And just before the screen flickered to black, the shadow turned toward the camera, and I swear I saw a face. I shut the monitor off, and back on again, but the screen remained black. A sick, twisting feeling settled deep in my gut. I looked up at Emma, who was holding Lily close, rocking her gently in her arms. "She's fine," Emma whispered, but I could hear the unease in her voice. "There's no one here." It had to be interference, right? I didn't answer. I stepped closer to the crib, my eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The nightlight cast soft shadows along the walls, stretching the shapes of Lily's stuffed animals across the floor. The rocking chair in the corner sat eerily still. I swallowed hard. We both heard it. Emma nodded hesitantly. Maybe it was picking up a radio signal or something. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the words that voice had been singing, the lullaby, weren't in any language I recognized. And that shadow, I shook the thought away. "Let's just take her into our room tonight," I muttered. "Just to be safe." Emma didn't argue. She carried Lily back to our bedroom, while I grabbed the baby monitor, and took one last look at the nursery. Before shutting off the light, I left the door slightly ajar, just in case. As soon as we settled into bed, Lily curled up between us, already drifting back to sleep. I pulled the blankets up, still gripping the baby monitor tightly in my hand. I debated turning it back on. A part of me didn't want to know, but I had to. With a deep breath, I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. For a moment it was normal. Just a grainy black and white image of Lily's crib, now empty. Then the screen glitched, and the lullaby started again. Soft, whispering, coming through the monitor. My chest tightened. I turned to Emma, my voice low. "Do you hear that?" She sat up instantly, her breath catching. "Oh my God." Then a creak. From inside the nursery, the monitor screen flickered. The crib, the rocking chair, the closet door, which I had left slightly open, was now wide open, and inside, barely visible through the grainy feed, something moved. A hand, curling slowly around the doorframe, long fingers too thin. A face just out of view. I slammed the monitor off, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Emma clutched Lily tighter, her whole body trembling. "Call someone," she whispered. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, dialing 911. As the ringing tone filled my ear, another sound made my blood run cold. The baby monitor, though turned off, still whispered, Soft, gentle. A voice just beyond the speaker. "We just want the baby." I dropped the monitor, my body going rigid. The line clicked. A voice on the other end. Not the dispatcher. The same whispering voice from the monitor. "You shouldn't have taken her away." The call cut off, and from the nursery, the closet door slammed shut. The slam of the closet door sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. The entire house went deathly silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making your own breathing sound too loud. Emma clutched Lily tightly, her eyes wide with panic. I grabbed the nearest object I could, a bedside lamp, and moved toward the nursery. Every muscle in my body screamed at me not to go in there. But I had no choice. I had to see. I had to know. The hallway stretched before me, dark and endless, my footsteps barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. The nursery door stood slightly open, just as I had left it, but the air that seeped out from inside was cold, unnaturally cold. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The nightlight still glowed, casting an eerie, golden hue over the crib. The baby blanket lay in a heap where Emma had picked up Lily earlier. The rocking chair was still, but the closet door, it was open again, just a crack. My heart pounded against my ribs. I took a step forward, gripping the lamp so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I reached out with my free hand, and the closet burst open. A wave of cold air hit me, and before I could react, something moved inside. Not rushed, not aggressive, slow, deliberate. A shape stepped forward, unfolding from the shadows like a puppet being pulled into the light. My breath hitched. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs stretched in ways that didn't make sense. Its fingers too long curled slightly at its sides. And its face. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. And yet I felt it looking at me. The whispering started again. Not from its mouth, from inside my head. "We only want the baby." I staggered back, my entire body trembling. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, from behind me, Emma's scream. I spun around and ran. Emma was still in our bedroom, clutching Lily, her face pale with terror. The baby monitor sat on the floor, where I had dropped it. But now, the screen was flickering wildly. On it, the nursery, the closet door, swinging open again on its own. And that thing, standing in front of Lily's crib, waiting. I didn't think. I grabbed Emma's hand, yanking her toward the door. "We're leaving. Now." She didn't argue. We bolted down the stairs, Lily beginning to wail in Emma's arms. The house felt like it was closing in, the air growing heavier, thicker, as if something was trying to keep us inside. But I didn't stop. I wrenched the front door open, and we ran, into the cold night, into the street, into the safety of the neighbor's porch, where I pounded on their door until they finally answered. The police arrived within minutes. They found nothing. The nursery was untouched. The closet was closed. The baby monitor showed only an empty room. No sign of anyone inside. No signs of forced entry. No proof of what we had seen. But I knew the truth. I saw the way the officers avoided looking at the baby monitor when it crackled. Just for a moment with static. I saw the way Lily stared at the screen, her tiny fingers reaching toward it, as if she recognized something. We moved out of that house the next day. We never went back, and we never ever used a baby monitor again. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I can still hear it. A lullaby, soft, gentle, whispering through the static, and Lily, smiling in her sleep. I moved to the farmhouse for peace and quiet. After years in the city, I wanted nothing more than open space, fresh air, and the kind of stillness that didn't come with honking horns and sirens. I found the place cheap, too cheap really. A quaint little house nestled between rolling fields, with nothing but a dirt road stretching out for miles in either direction. The real selling point, though, was the cornfield, acres and acres of it stretching beyond the horizon, its golden stalks swaying gently in the wind. Something about it felt alive, always shifting, whispering when the breeze moved through. I liked it. At least, I did at first. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch, listening to the wind hum through the fields, watching the sun dip below the horizon. There was something peaceful about it, the way the corn turned to shadows in the fading light. But on the fourth night, as dusk settled in, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the corn. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the setting sun casting odd shapes through the stalks. But as I squinted, my stomach twisted into a slow knot. It wasn't a shadow, it was a person, a tall figure, completely still, standing just at the edge of the field. Their back was to the sunset, their body little more than a silhouette against the dying light. I couldn't make out any details. No clothes, no face, just a dark shape, watching. A chill crawled up my spine. My nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car pass since I moved in. Who the hell would be standing in my field? I cleared my throat, forcing my voice steady. Hello. The figure didn't move. I stood slowly, gripping the arms of the rocking chair. You need something. No response. I glanced down for half a second, just a quick blink, and when I looked up, they were gone. The corn hadn't moved. No rustling, no parting of the stalks, nothing to suggest someone had walked away. Just gone. I felt like a fool for how fast I locked the doors that night. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the light really had cast some strange illusion. Maybe I was overreacting. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. There were footprints in the dirt, leading from the cornfield, leading closer to my house. I tried to ignore it. I spent the next day working around the house, unpacking the last few boxes, busying my mind with chores and distractions. But as dusk fell again, I felt it before I even looked. That sinking feeling, that prickle at the back of my neck. I turned toward the cornfield, and there they were, standing just a little closer than the night before, still completely motionless, still watching. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. You need to leave. I called out, trying to keep my voice firm. No response. I stepped to the edge of the porch, my hands curling into fists. You hear me? I don't know what kind of joke this is, but it's not funny. Nothing. The last of the sunlight faded behind the trees, casting long dark shadows across the land. I blinked, and just like the night before, they were gone. I shuddered and went inside, locking every door and window before sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the clock. I wasn't going crazy. I knew what I saw. Something wasn't right. The next morning I hesitated before stepping outside. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, heart hammering against my ribs. The footprints were there, even closer now, deep indentations in the dirt, trailing up the porch steps before stopping right in front of the door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, shotgun in my lap, watching the porch through the living room window. I wasn't taking any chances. The clock ticked slow. Every shadow felt too long. Every creak in the house sent my pulse spiking. I waited, breath held, for them to appear again, and just after midnight, they did. But this time, they weren't in the field. They were on the porch. I couldn't breathe. The figure stood just outside the door, barely visible in the moonlight, their face shrouded in darkness. A soft, slow knock rattled against the wood. Not urgent, not impatient, just deliberate. I gripped the shotgun, my knuckles white. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, "Let me in." The whisper slithered through the door, sending a sharp, paralyzing chill through my entire body. Let me in. I gripped the shotgun tighter, sweat slicking my palms. My breath came in shallow gasps. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something. But I just sat there, frozen, staring at the dark shape through the thin curtains of the living room window. The figure didn't knock again. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. Seconds stretched into minutes. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. My pulse pounded so hard in my ears that I barely registered the moment when the figure vanished. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear the porch creak. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. But I knew it wasn't over. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my back against the farthest wall of the house, the shotgun in my lap, my eyes locked onto the door, The hours dragged. Every shift of the wind outside made my stomach coil tighter. At some point, the first rays of dawn slipped through the windows, and I finally exhaled. I stood on shaky legs, stepping cautiously to the door. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it, swinging it open. The porch was empty. I took a slow step outside, my stomach twisting violently as I looked down. The footprints were back, only this time, they didn't stop at the door. They went around the house, trailing past the windows, circling. I ran a hand through my damp hair, a sick feeling curling in my gut. This wasn't some prank. It wasn't my imagination. Something had been watching me, and they had gotten too close. I spent the next day on edge, watching the cornfield from every window, the shotgun always within reach. My phone sat uselessly on the table. No reception, no internet, just an empty signal bar that mocked me every time I checked it. By late afternoon, my resolve hardened. I couldn't stay here. This house, this land was wrong. I stuffed a duffel bag with whatever essentials I could grab and tossed it into my truck, slamming the door shut. The engine rumbled to life beneath my shaking hands, headlights cutting through the dimming light as the sun dipped below the trees. Then I made the mistake of looking back, and my stomach dropped. The figure was there, standing in the field, only now, it wasn't at the edge. It was right at the fence line, closer than ever. The fear that gripped me wasn't just instinct, it was primal. Something deep in my bones told me that if I stayed here one more night, I wouldn't see the sunrise. I slammed my foot on the gas. Gravel kicked up behind me as I sped down the dirt road, hands clutching the wheels so tight, my knuckles turned white. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away. But then, the truck jerked. The entire frame shuddered violently, throwing me forward against the dashboard. The tires screeched, the engine groaned, and in a sickening lurch, the truck died. I gasped, my body shaking as I fumbled with the keys, turning the ignition. Nothing, no rumble, no engine light, just silence. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin like something was watching. I reached for the shotgun, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Then I heard it. The rustling, not from the trees, not from the wind, from the cornfield. Slow, deliberate, coming toward me. A shape emerged from the rows, stepping onto the road just ahead of my truck. It was tall, too tall. Its arms hung unnaturally long. At its sides, fingers twitching. The head was wrong, tilted at an angle that wasn't humanly possible, as if the neck had been snapped. But the worst part, it had no face, just a stretch of smooth pale skin, where eyes and a mouth should have been. The thing stood there, head tilted, almost like it was listening to the sound of my breathing. Then it took a step forward. My body reacted before my brain did. I fired the shotgun. The blast echoed through the night, the force shaking my arms. The creature's head snapped backward from the impact. For one terrifying second, I thought it was over. But then, it straightened, unfazed, unhurt. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed the door handle, threw it open, and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the road, the sound of heavy footsteps following. My breath came in ragged gulps, my chest tight with panic. The cornfield blurred past me. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and then I saw them. More figures, stepping out from the corn, one by one, their heads twisted unnaturally, their smooth, empty faces reflecting the blood-red moon overhead. They weren't watching from the field anymore. They were waiting. I ran harder, my vision tunneling, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then from behind me, a voice, soft, familiar, impossible. Come back home. I knew that voice. I hadn't heard it in years. I turned my head, and standing right beside me, running in step with me was my mother. Dead, for 10 years. Her face was perfect, untouched by time. But her eyes were gone, just empty, black pits. I screamed, and then the world went dark. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. A farmer found me, collapsed on the side of the highway, miles from my house, covered in dirt and scratches that looked like claw marks. The police checked the property. The house was empty. No footprints, no evidence of anyone ever watching. And the cornfield, it had been burned to the ground. No explanation, no cause, just gone. I never went back. I sold the land, the house, everything. But some nights when I close my eyes, I still hear them, rustling in the corn, knocking at my window, calling me home. The house was perfect. I had been searching for months, scrolling through listings every night, visiting property after property, only to find one disappointment after another. Too expensive, too small, too close to the city, too far from civilization. But this one was just right. It was an old Victorian, sitting alone on a quiet street, lined with massive oak trees, the kind of place that felt like home the second I stepped inside. The hardwood floors creaked just enough to be charming. The walls carried a faint scent of old books and time-worn secrets, and the kitchen had a window that looked out over a sprawling backyard. The realtor was eager to sell. She offered a deal so low it almost felt like stealing. "There's just one thing," she said, shifting awkwardly as she guided me toward the basement door. "The previous owner sealed this shut years ago. No one's been down there since." I frowned. "Why?" She hesitated, forcing a smile. "No reason really. He was just an odd man, didn't want to deal with repairs, I guess." I reached out, running my fingers over the thick wooden planks nailed across the basement door. Something about it felt wrong, but I ignored the feeling. A sealed basement wasn't enough to scare me off. 2 weeks after moving in, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed the door, that same unease slithered through me. A subtle whisper in the back of my mind, telling me that it shouldn't be closed. I told myself I just wanted to make use of the space, maybe turn it into a wine cellar, or a workshop, or just extra storage. It was my house now. So I grabbed a crowbar. It took longer than I expected. The nails were old but strong, embedded deep into the wood as if whoever sealed the door never wanted it opened again. Sweat dripped down my back as I worked, forcing the planks free one by one, the sharp groan of breaking wood echoing through the house. Finally, after what felt like forever, I yanked the last board away and gripped the rusted doorknob. The door swung open with a loud aching creak. A wave of cold air hit me instantly. I hesitated, heart thudding in my chest, as I stared down into the darkness. A single narrow staircase disappeared into the black. I expected the scent of dust and decay, but instead, the air smelled damp, like the earth itself had been growing beneath the house. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam wavered slightly as I stepped onto the first creaking stair, then the second, then the third. The basement was bigger than I expected. Faint outlines of furniture sat shrouded in white sheets, the ghostly shapes of chairs and tables frozen in time. A small old-fashioned rocking chair sat in the farthest corner, unmoving, and in the center of the ceiling, a single flickering light bulb dangled from a chain, swinging slightly as if someone had just touched it. I swallowed hard. The air was too still, too expectant. I forced myself to take a few more steps forward, my footsteps sending up soft clouds of dust. There were deep scratches in the wooden floor, long jagged marks, as if something with claws had been dragged across it. A cold breath of air brushed against the back of my neck. I turned sharply, flashlight shaking. Nothing there, just the open door, the stairs leading back up to safety. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was being ridiculous. This was just a normal basement, probably untouched for decades. But then, as I turned to leave, a sound froze me in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the stairs behind me. I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam wavered, illuminating the staircase. My blood turned to ice. The basement door was closed. I hadn't closed it, and there was a shadow standing at the top of the stairs, not moving, just watching. I couldn't breathe. The light bulb flickered wildly, the air growing colder. The shadow stepped forward. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, hitting the door with all my strength, fumbling for the handle with shaking hands. The knob wouldn't turn. Something whispered my name, right behind me. I slammed my fist against the wood. "Let me out." Then the door flew open. I stumbled forward, landing hard on the kitchen floor. Gasping for breath, the house was silent. I turned back. The basement was dark, empty. The door sat wide open, the way it had been when I first came down. My heart slammed against my ribs. Had I imagined it? No, because something had closed that door, and something had been standing there, watching. I shoved the door shut, grabbed the nearest chair, and jammed it under the handle. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, I told myself I would never go down there again. But that afternoon, as I was making coffee, I noticed something that made my stomach turn violently. The chair, the one I had wedged under the doorknob, it was back in its original spot, and the basement door was open again. The basement door was open again. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a sickening rhythm against the suffocating silence of the house. I knew I had jammed the chair under the knob. I knew I had locked that door, but now it sat slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning wide, stretching into something deeper than shadow. My gut twisted. Something had opened it. I should have walked away. I should have left the house, driven to a hotel, called someone, anyone, but something pulled me forward, an unseen weight curling around my chest, dragging me closer. The air turned cold as I stepped toward the door. I reached out, barely nudging it. The hinges groaned softly as it swung open the rest of the way, revealing the pitch-black stairs leading down. I swallowed hard. The light bulb in the basement flickered. A single creak echoed from below. I took a step back. Then I heard it. A voice, a whisper curling up from the darkness like a breath of frozen air. "Come down." I stopped breathing. My fingers trembled around the doorframe. The whisper wasn't distant. It was right at the bottom of the stairs. I clenched my jaw. No, I wasn't going down there again. I wasn't going to let whatever was down there lure me in. I reached for the door. Then the rocking chair moved. I watched, frozen in place, as the sheet covering it slowly slipped to the floor, and in the dim flickering light, I saw what was sitting in it. Not dust, not an old cushion, a figure, slumped over, skin dry and brittle, like old paper, a human-shaped husk, hollowed out, its hands folded neatly in its lap, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I didn't have time to scream. The basement door slammed shut. I don't remember getting to my truck. I don't remember grabbing my keys, or starting the engine, or speeding down the empty road at 3 in the morning, leaving everything I owned behind. All I remember is the feeling of something standing at the window as I drove away, watching, waiting. I called the realtor the next day, told her I wanted nothing to do with the house. She didn't argue. She just sighed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have warned you." I gripped the phone tighter. "Warned me about what?" She hesitated. "The man who lived there before you. He was a recluse, never left the house, never spoke to anyone. One day, people realized they hadn't seen him in months. When the police searched the house, they found the basement door nailed shut. A cold shudder crawled down my spine. And when they finally pried it open," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "they found his body, sitting in that rocking chair, mummified, like he had been there for years." My stomach turned. "But," I swallowed hard, "that doesn't make sense. If he died down there, then who?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because I already knew. Whoever, or whatever, was in that basement, was never really gone. I never went back. I never even drove past the house again. Someone else bought it a few months later. A young couple. I check the news sometimes, searching for anything about the house. But there's nothing. No reports, no police calls, no missing persons, just silence. And that's what scares me the most, because if no one ever leaves, it means they must still be down there, sitting in that chair, rocking, waiting. The first time I noticed the scarecrow, I didn't think much of it. I'd owned this farm for 30 years, and never put one up myself, but maybe the wind had uncovered something left behind by the previous owner. It stood out there in the middle of my cornfield, straw hat tilted slightly, arms stretched wide like it was welcoming the wind. The second morning, I frowned. The scarecrow had moved. It was closer now, maybe 10 feet closer to the house than before. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe some animal knocking it loose. The wind had been strong last night. By the third morning, it was undeniable. The thing was now halfway across the field, standing dead center between my porch and where I first saw it. My gut twisted, but I tried to be rational. Someone was playing a prank, probably some bored teenagers from town. The closest neighbor was nearly a mile down the road, and I hadn't seen a soul out here in weeks. But maybe someone thought it'd be funny to mess with the old farmer. That night, I sat by the window with my shotgun resting on my lap, staring out at the field. The moon was bright, casting long shadows between the cornstalks, but nothing moved. Just the whisper of the wind pushing through the leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket. Then at some point in the night, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the house. A soft, slow scraping. My breath caught in my throat. The shotgun was still in my lap, my hands sweaty against the wood. I reached for the lamp, hesitating. My instinct screamed, "Don't turn it on." Instead, I turned my gaze toward the window. The scarecrow was right there, not in the field, not halfway across, right at the edge of my porch. I couldn't move. My pulse pounded in my skull as I stared at it. In the dim moonlight, I could just barely make out its face. A burlap sack with 2 black pits where eyes should be. A slit of a mouth, stitched crudely with twine. It was still, completely still, but something about it felt wrong. The way it leaned slightly forward, as if it were listening. The scraping sound came again. My stomach clenched. The scarecrow's arms were no longer stretched wide. They were at its sides. I slammed the lamp on, and in that second of hesitation, it was gone. Just gone. I bolted for the door, shotgun raised, stepping out onto the porch, scanning the field. The corn rustled in the distance, but the field was empty. The scarecrow wasn't there, but I knew it wasn't over. I barely slept the rest of the night, every sound making me jump. The image of that thing burned into my mind. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself outside, my hands shaking as I walked through the field. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, morning dew clinging to the leaves, but everything felt off. Then I saw it. The scarecrow was back in the middle of the field, like it had never moved, like it was playing a game. My mouth went dry. The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I made a decision. I was going to burn it. I waited until sunset, then grabbed my kerosene canister and headed toward the scarecrow. My heart slammed against my ribs with every step, sweat sliding down my back, despite the cool air. As I reached it, I hesitated. Up close, the thing looked worse. The burlap sack had dark stains around the stitched mouth, as if something had leaked through from the inside. The straw arms looked thicker, almost meatier, like they weren't just filled with straw anymore. I gritted my teeth, doused the thing in kerosene, and struck a match. The flames caught instantly, flickering up its legs, climbing toward its outstretched arms. The smell of burning cloth, and something else, something foul, filled the air. I watched it burn, refusing to look away until nothing remained but blackened scraps and smoldering ash. I told myself it was over. I told myself it was just a prank, just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But at exactly midnight, I woke to a sound that turned my blood to ice. Knocking, slow, deliberate, on my bedroom window. The knocking didn't stop. Slow, rhythmic taps against the glass, coming from my bedroom window. I couldn't move. My body felt locked in place, heart hammering so hard, it felt like my ribs might snap. The shotgun was still on the nightstand where I left it, but my arms wouldn't reach for it. I forced myself to breathe. Just one deep inhale, one shaky exhale. Then, with every ounce of courage I had left, I turned my head toward the window. My blood ran ice cold. The scarecrow was there, not outside in the field, not even on the porch. It was right at the window. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The burlap sack, twisted like a noose, had wrenched it sideways. The black pits where eyes should be were staring directly at me. Its mouth, stitched tight with twine, looked different now. like the fabric had stretched, like it was smiling. The knocking came again, but its arms didn't move. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My skin felt electric with panic, my body screaming at me to run. Then the scarecrow moved, not with a jerk, not like a person. It was wrong. It glided, like something shifting just beneath the burlap, pulling it forward in slow, twitching motions. It wasn't just knocking, it was coming inside. The glass cracked. I shot out of bed, grabbing the shotgun, fumbling with the shells as the window pane splintered, the pressure against it growing stronger. A single sharp hiss came from the other side of the glass. Not the wind, not an animal, something angry. I loaded the shell, raised the gun, and fired. The blast shattered the window, sending shards of glass flying. The air smelled like smoke and gunpowder, my ears ringing from the shot. And just like that, the scarecrow was gone. My breath came in sharp, hissing gasps. I stood there, gun raised, waiting for something, anything to move. The night was still. The wind whispered through the broken window, the curtains swaying lightly. Had I imagined it? No, I saw it. The scarecrow had been right there. I grabbed my boots, threw on my coat, and stormed outside. I was done playing this game. If that thing was still in my field, I was going to end this. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the empty rows of corn. My breath fogged in the cold night air. As I moved forward, shotgun steady, and then I saw it. Not in the field, not in the ashes where I had burned it, but at the edge of the forest. The scarecrow was standing just beyond the tree line, its head cocked, its stitched mouth still twisted into that awful stretched grin. And it wasn't alone. Shapes began emerging from the trees, tall thin figures wrapped in burlap, arms hanging limply at their sides. Their heads all had the same stitched faces, their bodies jerking with unnatural twitches as they stepped forward. One, then two, then five, then dozens. A sea of them, shifting through the trees, all moving toward me. My stomach dropped. The scarecrow I had burned hadn't been the only one. I backpedaled, shotgun raised, heart slamming against my ribs. I fired again, the shot tearing through the night. One of the figures jerked, but it didn't fall. It kept moving, bullet holes in the burlap, leaking something thick and black. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the house, my boots slamming against the dirt. My porch light glowed dimly in the distance, but it felt miles away. Behind me, I heard them running too, not stumbling, running. I hit the porch, threw open the door, and slammed it shut, locking the deadbolt with shaking hands. Silence. Then the thumping began. Not knocking, pounding, hundreds of fists slamming against the walls, the windows, the doors. The entire house shook, the wood creaking beneath the force. I sank to the floor, shotgun still clutched in my hands. They weren't leaving. I could hear them breathing, hissing, and then, all at once, they stopped. The air went still. The pounding ceased. I waited, barely breathing, my back pressed against the door. And then I heard it, a single slow knock, coming from inside the house. I turned, my body locking up. The basement door. It was open. The steps leading down were pitch black. The darkness waiting for me. A soft shuffle echoed from below. And then a whisper. A voice that wasn't human. That wasn't mine. You shouldn't have burned him. The basement door slammed shut. I never saw the scarecrows again. Never heard them. Never found a single trace of them in my field. But I never opened that basement door again. Because some nights when the wind is just right, I still hear them. My parents had left for the weekend, heading to a wedding in another state. It wasn't the first time I'd been left alone, but this was the first time it was for more than a night. I didn't mind. In fact, I was kind of excited to have the house to myself. No one telling me to turn down the TV. No annoying reminders to do my homework. No little sibling barging into my room to ask stupid questions. Just me, my Xbox, and the leftovers my mom had packed in the fridge. The first evening was uneventful. I ordered a pizza, watched a horror movie, and played video games until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. At around midnight, I finally dragged myself upstairs, brushed my teeth, and flopped onto my bed. The house was quiet, a little too quiet, now that I thought about it. Normally, I'd hear my parents' muffled voices from their room, or my sister's nightlight humming softly across the hall. But now, there was nothing but the faint creaks of the house settling, the distant hum of the fridge downstairs. I told myself it was fine, just the usual sounds of an empty house, and closed my eyes. At first I wasn't sure what woke me up. I opened my eyes, blinking at the ceiling, my brain still sluggish with sleep. Then I heard it. A soft rhythmic creaking, like footsteps. My heart started to beat a little faster. I lifted my head slightly, straining to hear. The sound was faint, but it was there. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards shifting under weight. Not the random pops and groans of an old house. Someone was walking. I sat up, staring at the darkened doorway of my room. The hallway outside was pitch black, my door only half open. I reached for my phone on my nightstand and turned on the screen. 2:47 a.m. I hesitated. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind rattling the house, or some stupid shift in the foundation. That had to be it. But then it came again, louder. This time, a step, then another. Slow, careful. I swallowed hard and forced myself to get up. My feet touched the cold floor, and I crept toward the door. My pulse thudded in my ears as I pressed my back against the wall, reaching out slowly to push the door open just a little more. The hallway stretched into darkness. My sister's door was closed. My parents' room was empty. The only light came from the faint glow of the nightlight near the stairs. I held my breath and listened. Silence. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, waiting for another sound, but eventually, my muscles started to ache from tension. I was being stupid. There was no one here, just my imagination messing with me because I had watched that horror movie earlier. Exhaling slowly, I turned back toward my bed, and then my phone vibrated in my hand. I almost dropped it. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fumbled to check the screen. A text from my mom. My stomach did a weird flip as I opened it. "Why is there someone standing in the hallway behind you?" I froze. My whole body went cold. My breath hitched as every hair on my arms stood on end. Slowly, stiffly, I turned my head. The hallway was empty. The same stretch of darkness. The faint glow from the nightlight. Nothing else. But my chest felt tight, my skin crawling with something unseen. I spun back to my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed. "What are you talking about?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "I just checked the security cameras. There's someone behind you." My stomach dropped to my feet. I felt like I was going to throw up. My parents had installed security cameras a few months ago. One was in the hallway, another in the living room. My mom had access to them from her phone. I forced myself to turn around again, my whole body trembling. My eyes darted frantically over the dark hallway, scanning every inch. There was nothing there, nothing I could see. But then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The hallway nightlight was off. It had been on when I first opened my door. I was sure of it. I took a step back into my room, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. "Mom, I don't see anyone." "Are you sure?" The dots appeared again. My heart slammed against my ribs as I waited. "Check under your bed." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My skin felt like ice, my stomach twisting into painful knots. I stared at the message, my mind racing. No, no way. I looked down at my bed. The darkness beneath it stretched deep, shadows too thick, too black. I didn't want to do it. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But I had to know. I took a slow, shaky breath and dropped to my knees. My fingers dug into the floor as I leaned forward, tilting my head to peer into the void beneath the bed. For a moment I saw nothing, just the wooden floor, a few lost socks, an old notebook. Then I saw it. A pair of eyes, wide, unblinking, staring right at me. I couldn't scream. The sound caught in my throat, strangled by pure terror. The eyes beneath the bed didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I scrambled back so fast I hit my nightstand, knocking my phone to the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps, my limbs shaking as I tried to process what I had just seen. My mind fought against it, told me it wasn't real, but my body knew better. Something was under my bed. Something had been there the whole time. My hands fumbled blindly for my phone. I grabbed it, my fingers so sweaty, I almost dropped it again. I wanted to call my mom, to call 911, to call anyone, but my hands were shaking too hard to press the right buttons. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I took a picture. I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed against it, but I had to know if I was losing my mind. My thumb hovered over the camera button, and then click. The flash lit up the room for a split second, and I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, I forced myself to look at the screen. The photo was blurry, unfocused, but the shape was there. A face, not human, too pale, too stretched. The eyes were black pits, the mouth grinning, my vision blurred with panic. My heart hammered so hard, it hurt. I turned my head back toward the bed, expecting it to lunge at me, expecting hands to shoot out and drag me under. But when I looked again, nothing. The space under the bed was empty. I stared, my breath shallow, my mind unable to comprehend what was happening. It was there. I had seen it. The photo. I glanced at my phone again. The picture was gone. Not deleted. Just gone. Like it had never existed. My chest tightened with suffocating dread. My mind screamed for me to get out, to run. My legs felt locked in place, stiff with fear. Then, somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. I snapped my head toward my bedroom door. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, but suffocating in its silence. Then, another sound, a soft dragging shuffle. Something was moving downstairs. I barely had time to react before my phone vibrated again. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked the screen. Mom, get out of the house, now. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my hoodie from the floor, shoved my feet into my sneakers, and bolted. I didn't stop to turn off the lights. I didn't stop to grab anything else. I ran. The hallway felt too long, like I was moving in slow motion. My feet heavy, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. As I reached the stairs, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to stop, but my fear made me glance down. Mom, it's in the living room. Don't let it see you. A strangled noise caught in my throat. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to stop. I was halfway down, and then I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, just past the dim glow of the kitchen light, something was standing in the shadows of the living room. Tall, too tall, its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted, watching, waiting. My breath caught. It hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. Not yet, but somehow, I knew it, knew I was there. I didn't dare breathe. Slowly, I shifted my weight, stepping back up the stairs, one step at a time. My whole body trembled, my muscles screaming to turn and run. But I knew if I did, it would chase me. It wanted me to run. The shadows around it seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally, as if they were alive. The thing twitched, just barely, a tiny unnatural movement, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. My phone buzzed again. I flinched, my fingers barely able to hold onto it. Mom, go back. Hide. I swallowed down the rising terror clawing at my throat. My legs felt like jelly. As I took another slow step backward, then another. The thing didn't move, but I felt it watching, felt it waiting. I made it to the top of the stairs, my breath coming in silent gasps. The moment I was out of sight, I bolted down the hall and into my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. I pressed my back against the wood, my chest heaving. My phone was still clutched in my shaking hands. The screen glowing in the darkness. 3 dots appeared. Then a message. Mom, it's coming up the stairs. My breath hitched, my fingers tightening around my phone, until my knuckles turned white. I stared at the message, unable to move, unable to think. My heart pounded against my ribs so hard, I thought it would bruise. Then I heard it. A soft creak. The first step. I clamped a hand over my mouth, swallowing the gasp that threatened to escape. My body pressed harder against the door, as if that alone could keep me safe. my ears strained in the suffocating silence. Another creak, then another, slow, deliberate. It was coming up the stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. I needed to hide. I needed to move. But my body wouldn't listen. Fear had paralyzed me, kept me frozen against the door, like a child afraid of the dark. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to take my eyes off the door. But I forced myself to glance down. Mom, don't make a sound. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this thing was, or how it had gotten inside. My mind screamed for answers, but none of them mattered. All that mattered was surviving. Another creak, closer now. It was almost at the top. I forced my legs to move, crawling backward, my body shaking so badly, I thought my bones would rattle. My bed, that was my only option. I slid underneath, biting down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. Then I went still. The house was silent again. I held my breath, my entire body screaming for oxygen. But I didn't dare inhale. Then the doorknob rattled. My stomach clenched, my fingers digging into the carpet. The door was locked. It couldn't get in. It couldn't. A soft click echoed through the room. The knob turned. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to throw myself out the window if I had to. But my body wouldn't move. I lay there, frozen, staring at the darkness beneath my bed. As the door creaked open, a slow, heavy breath filled the room. Not mine. The floorboards groaned as something stepped inside. The air shifted. The room suddenly too cold. The shadows stretching unnaturally. Then the breathing changed. It wasn't slow anymore. It was sniffing, like it was searching, looking for me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to disappear. The weight of its presence pressed against my skin, an overwhelming sensation of something wrong. Then the bed creaked. I almost sobbed. It was leaning over. I could feel it. I bit down harder on my lip, forcing myself not to cry, not to move. A slow shuffling step, then another. It was right beside the bed now. My lungs burned from holding my breath, but I couldn't risk it. Not yet. Silence. Then, a soft whisper, low, garbled, too close. I see you. My body jerked in panic. I couldn't help it. My foot twitched, just a tiny movement, but enough. Everything went still. A beat of silence, stretched too thin. Then, a hand shot under the bed. I screamed. It grabbed my ankle. Fingers too long, too thin. Ice cold and wrong. I kicked wildly, thrashing, my heels slamming into something hard. A guttural hiss filled the room, a sound that wasn't human. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I launched myself out from under the bed, scrambling to my feet. My door was open. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see it. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted down the hallway, the walls narrowing, the air thick with something unseen. As I reached the stairs, my phone buzzed again. I almost dropped it in my panic. Mom, get outside. Now I didn't question it. I threw myself down the stairs, nearly tripping as I hit the bottom. The front door loomed ahead, impossibly far, like the house was stretching. Behind me the thing moved, fast, too fast. I felt it, the shift in the air, the cold breath against my neck. I reached the door, my shaking fingers fumbling with the lock. The handle wouldn't turn. I yanked, pulled, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then I felt it, right behind me. The whisper so close it brushed against my ear. Stay. The lock clicked. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I ripped the door open and ran into the night. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the street. Not until I was sure it hadn't followed me. The cold night air burned my lungs as I ran, my bare feet slapping against the pavement. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to be far, far away from the house. My legs ached, my body trembling from exhaustion and terror. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was sure it wasn't behind me. I finally collapsed on the sidewalk. A few houses down, my breath coming in ragged gas. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. But I forced myself to check the screen. There were 3 new messages. Mom, Are you out? Mom, where are you? Mom, don't go back inside. I swallowed, my mouth dry as sandpaper. My fingers fumbled to type a response. Me, I'm outside. Down the street. What is happening? The reply came instantly. Mom, stay there. Don't move. I'm calling the police. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to explain what the hell was going on, but my mind was still spinning, my body barely able to function. My house loomed in the distance, its windows dark, the front door still slightly open. I squinted, my breath hitching. Something was standing just inside the doorway, a tall, stretched out shadow, watching me. My stomach twisted painfully. The thing wasn't moving. It wasn't coming after me. It just stood there, motionless, its head slightly tilted. The longer I looked, the harder it was to breathe. Then, slowly, so slowly, it raised a hand and waved. A strangled noise caught in my throat, and I tore my gaze away, my whole body shivering violently. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus, trying to convince myself I was safe now. Distant sirens echoed in the night. The police, relief and fear twisted together inside me. As I sat on the curb, my arms wrapped around my knees. When I opened my eyes again, the doorway was empty. It was gone, but somehow, I knew this wasn't over. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the street, the sirens piercing through the quiet night. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions cautious but firm as they approached. I barely registered them asking me questions. My mind felt disconnected, like I was floating outside of my own body. I told them everything, about the noises, the thing under my bed, the message from my mom, the thing in the living room. They didn't look convinced. One officer stayed with me while the other went inside to check the house. I wanted to tell him not to go. I wanted to scream at him that it was still in there, that the house wasn't safe, but my throat felt tight. The words lodged somewhere deep and unreachable. 10 agonizing minutes passed before the officer returned. His face was unreadable, his expression stiff. There's no one in there, he said. Doors are locked, windows secure, no signs of forced entry. I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. That's not possible. He exchanged a glance with his partner, then looked back at me. Nothing's been tampered with. But, he hesitated, then sighed. The security system was disabled from inside the house. Do your parents normally turn it off when they leave? My blood ran cold. No. Another silence stretched between us, thick with something unspoken. The officer glanced back at the house, his brows furrowed. Look, kid, you said you saw something, but there's no sign of anyone breaking in. Are you sure it wasn't just a bad dream? Anger flared inside me. I wasn't dreaming. It was real. It would. I stopped myself, my pulse hammering. My mom. I pulled out my phone, nearly dropping it as I scrolled through my messages. My heart pounded so hard. It hurt. The messages from my mom were gone. Every single one. I stared at the screen, my breath quick and uneven. My hands shook as I opened my call log. No missed calls, no outgoing texts, no proof that she had ever messaged me at all. Panic clawed at my chest. No, she texted me. She told me to get out. She take deadalls. The officers exchanged another look, their expressions shifting from concern to something else. Pity. Maybe you were half asleep, one of them suggested, dreaming about checking your phone. That can feel real sometimes. No, I whispered, my voice cracking. No, it was real. I saw it. It was in my house. Neither of them responded. I felt sick. My head spun. Then my phone vibrated. I nearly dropped it. My fingers fumbled over the screen. As I unlocked it, my pulse hammering. A new message. Unknown number. You shouldn't have left. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. I looked up at the officers, my mouth dry, my mind screaming. But when I turned the screen toward them, the message was gone, like it had never existed. The officers didn't believe me. I could see it in their faces, the way their expressions softened, like I was just some scared kid with an overactive imagination. Maybe they thought I was lying. Maybe they thought I was sleep deprived, hallucinating. But I knew what I had seen. and I knew that whatever had been in my house wasn't gone. One of the officers drove me to the station, while the other stayed behind to do another sweep of the property. They said it was protocol, that they'd get in touch with my parents, and make sure I had somewhere safe to go for the night. I didn't argue. I didn't even speak. I just sat in the back of the patrol car, staring at my phone, my hands trembling. The messages were gone, every single one. My call log was empty. It was like my mom had never texted me at all, but I knew she had. The ride to the station was silent. The officer tried to make small talk at first, but when I didn't respond, he gave up. I kept checking my phone, hoping, praying for another message. Nothing. Then, as we pulled up to the station, my screen flickered, just for a second, barely noticeable, but I saw it. A single notification flashed at the top of my screen, before disappearing. Unknown number. I'm not finished with you. A cold wave of terror rolled through me. My body locked up, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I wanted to show the officer. I wanted to shove my phone in his face, and make him see that this wasn't in my head. But the message was gone. Again, the second we walked into the station, they had me sit in a small, cold room while they tried to get in touch with my parents. I sat there, hands in my lap, my leg bouncing uncontrollably. My mind raced in circles, trying to make sense of it all. What was it? How had it gotten in? Why had it let me go? Or worse, had it let me go? I kept expecting my phone to vibrate again, but it never did. The silence was worse than the messages. Then the door opened, and one of the officers stepped in, his face unreadable. "We got a hold of your parents," he said, sitting across from me. "Your mom is on the way back now. Your dad is trying to book the earliest flight home." I nodded, barely registering his words. The officer hesitated. Then, with a glance toward the one-way mirror, he leaned forward slightly. "Listen," he said, his voice lower now. "Off the record, are you sure you were alone in that house?" The question caught me off guard. I looked up at him, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We went through your house twice," he said, "checked every room, every closet, even the attic. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place." I swallowed. But, he continued, his voice tightening. "One thing was weird." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a scrap of paper, old, yellowed. A single sentence was scrawled across it in what looked like smeared ink. "I like watching you sleep." My stomach twisted into a tight knot. "We found it under your bed," the officer said quietly. I felt my blood run cold. The officer watched me carefully. "Do you recognize it?" I shook my head, my mouth too dry to speak. He sighed, then slipped the bag back into his pocket. "We're going to have someone stay outside your house for the rest of the night," he said. "Your mom will be here in a couple of hours. Until then, just try to breathe." "All right." I didn't respond, because I knew deep down that it didn't matter how many cops sat outside my house. It didn't matter if I locked the doors. If it wanted to come back, it would, and next time I might not be able to leave. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the station, my phone clutched in my hands, waiting, but no more messages came. No more signs that it was still watching. I told myself it was over. I told myself I was safe. The wind howled through the trees, a deafening roar that swallowed every other sound. Snow lashed against my face, sharp as needles, as I trudged forward through the endless white. My fingers had long since gone numb, the cold sinking deep into my bones, each breath a struggle against the freezing air. I had no idea how long I had been walking. My phone was dead, my watch useless under layers of frost. The trail had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by the relentless storm. I had wandered off course, lost in the wilderness with no sense of direction, no sign of anything but snow, and trees stretching endlessly in every direction. And then, just as my legs threatened to give out beneath me, I saw it, a cabin. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. My vision had blurred from exhaustion, the darkness creeping in at the edges. But as I staggered forward, the shape became clearer. Wooden walls, a slanted roof covered in a thick layer of snow, a single window flickering with the faint glow of firelight. I had never been so relieved in my life. Summoning the last of my strength, I forced myself toward the cabin, my boots crunching through the frozen ground. When I reached the door, I hesitated only for a moment, before pounding my fist against the rough wood. The storm swallowed the sound almost immediately. For a long moment, nothing happened. No movement inside, no voice answering my desperate knocks. I was about to try again, when the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He was older, his face weathered by years of harsh winters, deep lines carved into his skin. His eyes, sharp, almost too bright, scanned me from head to toe, before narrowing slightly. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. His voice was low, edged with something I couldn't quite place. "I got lost," I gasped, shivering violently. "Please, I just need somewhere to wait out the storm." The man didn't move for a moment. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside. "Get in, quickly." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled inside, the warmth of the fire hitting me like a physical force. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a stone fireplace crackling in the corner. A rough wooden table sat in the center, 2 chairs on either side. A cot was pushed against the far wall, covered in thick blankets. The man shut the door behind me, bolting it tightly before turning to face me. "Sit down," he said. "Warm yourself." I all but collapsed into the nearest chair, holding my hands out toward the fire, my fingers tingling painfully as the feeling began to return. The warmth seeped into my frozen skin, loosening the stiffness in my limbs. But even as I thawed, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. The man hadn't said a word since I'd come inside. He stood near the door, staring at the floor, his jaw tight. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, the wind howling outside. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found this place." The man finally looked at me. His expression was unreadable, something wary in his gaze. "You were lucky," he said slowly. "Not many make it out of those woods." I swallowed. "How far am I from the main trail?" His eyes flickered. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward a small shelf near the window, rummaging through a few items before pulling out a heavy blanket. He tossed it toward me. "You can stay here for the night," he said, "but there are rules." I frowned. "Rules?" His gaze was sharp, his expression dead serious. "You don't leave this cabin after dark. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay inside. Do you understand?" A strange chill crawled up my spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. I hesitated. "Why?" The man's jaw clenched. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. "Just listen to me," he said, his voice low, urgent. "You keep the fire going. You don't open the door. And whatever you do, you don't look outside." The uneasy feeling twisted into something sharper. My throat felt dry. "What's out there?" I asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, moving toward the cot. "Get some rest," he muttered. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but exhaustion was weighing me down, the warmth making my body heavy. I would ask in the morning, I told myself. Whatever he was afraid of, it couldn't be real, right? Then, somewhere outside, barely audible over the wind, something scratched against the walls. The sound was faint at first, barely noticeable over the wind, screaming through the trees. A soft, slow scratching, like something testing the walls, dragging claws over the wood. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just the wind, a tree branch scraping against the cabin. But then it came again, longer this time, deliberate. I turned toward the old man, but he hadn't moved. He sat stiffly on the edge of his cot, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched so tightly, I could see the muscles twitching. He wasn't sleeping, he was listening. I swallowed hard. "What is that?" The man didn't look at me. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles white. "Stay quiet," he whispered. I froze. The scratching stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling, the wind howling outside. My ears strained against the silence, waiting, dreading. Then the whisper came, soft, just beyond the cabin walls. It spoke my name. I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was distant, barely a breath on the wind, but unmistakable. It knew my name. I looked at the old man again, panic rising in my chest. Did you hear? His hand shot up, silencing me with a sharp motion. His face had gone pale. His eyes locked onto the door. A shadow passed by the window. I clamped a hand over my mouth. A sick crawling dread, slithering down my spine. It was tall, too tall, moving with an unnatural slowness, its form distorted by the frosted glass. The old man didn't move. He barely even breathed. I did the same. The fire crackled. The wind moaned. Then, a knock at the door, soft, gentle, like a friend asking to be let in. My entire body went rigid. I turned toward the old man, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the edges of the cot, so tightly his fingers trembled. The knock came again, then a voice, familiar, "Let me in." I nearly choked on my own breath. My blood turned to ice. It was my mother's voice, but my mother was hundreds of miles away. I shook my head violently, backing away from the door. "That's not." The old man grabbed my wrist, his grip iron tight. His eyes burned into mine, filled with something cold and unshakable. "It's not her," he whispered. The knocking turned to pounding, loud, insistent. The voice changed. It still sounded like my mother, but wrong, stretched, too deep, too hollow. "Let me in," it repeated. The door rattled in its frame. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to believe it. But then, a second voice joined the first. A man's voice. My father's. "Let us in," it pleaded. Then another. "My sister. Please, open the door." The voices layered on top of each other, growing louder, more desperate. A chorus of people I knew. Friends, family, voices I hadn't heard in years. They were all outside. They were all begging to be let in. The old man squeezed my wrist harder, dragging me back toward the fire. His voice was a hiss, barely audible over the noise. "Don't listen. Don't look. And whatever you do." The walls shuddered violently. The fire flickered. A deep rattling growl echoed from the darkness outside. "Don't open the door." The voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a frantic, distorted cacophony. The pounding at the door shook the entire cabin, rattling the walls, making the fire in the hearth flicker wildly. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. But even then, I could still hear them, whispers slipping through the cracks in the wood, crawling into my mind like cold fingers. "We're so cold. Let us in, son. Please. It's freezing out here." A sharp pain bloomed in my chest. My father's voice, my mother's, my sister's. They sounded so real, so desperate. I turned toward the old man, my throat tight. "It's lying," he said. Before I could even ask, his face was drawn, pale in the firelight. His grip on my wrist was iron. "It knows who you love, what you fear. It will use them against you." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. "What is it?" The old man's expression darkened. "A hunger." The pounding on the door stopped. The voices went silent. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then, from just outside, a slow, deliberate scrape, claws dragging against wood. My pulse slammed against my ribs. The thing outside, whatever it was, wasn't trying to get in anymore. It was waiting, watching. The old man stood abruptly. He moved to the fireplace, grabbing a long blackened poker from the flames. When he turned back to me, his eyes were colder than the storm outside. "You're lucky," he said, voice low. "It found you near my cabin. If you were alone out there, you'd already be dead." I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat. "You've seen it before." His jaw tightened many times. Another scrape against the wall. Then, softly, barely above a whisper, my name. The hair on my arm stood on end. I turned toward the window, unable to stop myself. The frost-covered glass was too thick to see through clearly, but I felt it. It was right there, waiting. The old man grabbed my shoulder, yanking me away from the window. His voice was sharp, urgent. Don't look at it. Don't speak to it. And no matter what happens, do not step outside. I nodded, my body still trembling. My thoughts were a mess, but one thing was clear. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to leave. The wind howled against the cabin, making the walls groan. The fire snapped and popped, the shadows dancing wildly across the room. Then, without warning, the front door clicked, not rattled, not pounded on. The lock turned. I stopped breathing. The old man's head snapped toward the door, his grip tightening around the fire poker. I could see the tension in his body, the sheer effort it took for him not to move, not to react. I wanted to scream that we had locked it, that it wasn't possible, but then the door creaked. Just slightly, just enough for the icy wind to slip through. The old man's voice was barely a whisper. It's testing us. I clenched my fists, trying to fight the panic rising in my chest. What do we do? He didn't answer right away. His gaze was locked on the door, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, we wait. The cabin went silent again. The door stayed still, cracked open just an inch. The wind outside had died down, leaving only an unnatural hush, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, a slow, heavy footstep. Inside the cabin, I felt my stomach drop. I turned my head, my body trembling so badly, I thought I might collapse. The door hadn't moved. It was still cracked open, but nothing had come through. So how? Then the fire flickered, the shadows stretched, and something exhaled behind me. A cold breath ghosted over the back of my neck. My entire body locked up, every muscle frozen in sheer terror. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. The old man reacted first, with a sharp intake of breath. He turned, swinging the fire poker through the air behind me. The motion was so fast, so violent, that I barely had time to flinch. The metal whooshed past my ear, cutting through empty space, or at least that's what I thought. Then the sound hit me, a low guttural snarl, like a wild animal but wrong, twisted, like it was trying to sound human but didn't quite understand how. The fire dimmed for a split second, the whole cabin plunging into shadow, and then it was gone. The old man stood panting, the poker clutched in his shaking hands. His eyes darted around the room, his breathing shallow. I turned, my heart in my throat. Nothing was there, but the door. The door was wide open now. Snow swirled in the open doorway, the wind cutting through the cabin like a blade. Outside, the forest stretched on endlessly, trees bending under the weight of the storm. But there was no sign of the thing. The old man lunged for the door, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the walls. He threw the bolt, double-checking the lock before spinning back toward me, his face pale and drawn. You saw that, right? My voice was barely a whisper. The old man didn't answer at first. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. Then, finally, he nodded. It was inside. My stomach twisted painfully. But how? The door, it doesn't need doors. His voice was grim. Not when it's hungry. I swallowed, my throat dry. Then why didn't it just take us? His expression darkened. Because it wants us to come to it. I felt my blood turn to ice. The old man stepped closer, gripping my shoulder. His fingers were like steel, his eyes boring into mine. That's why it speaks with familiar voices, why it scratches at the walls. It doesn't hunt like an animal. It waits, it whispers, it makes you doubt yourself, makes you want to open the door. I nodded slowly, trying to steady my breath, but a sick, gnawing fear had taken root inside me. Because part of me had wanted to open the door, part of me still did. The air in the cabin felt heavy, thick with something unseen. The fire crackled weakly, its warmth doing nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep into my bones. Then, from outside, the voices came again, soft, faint, drifting through the cracks in the wood. My sister, my father, my mother. But this time, they were screaming. I slapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The screams burrowed into my skull, raw and desperate, filled with agony. My mother's voice cracked between sobs. "Please, it's hurting us." My father, his tone ragged. "God, please, help us." My sister, wailing like a wounded animal. I squeezed my eyes shut. "They're not real," I muttered. "They're not real. They're not real." A hand gripped my wrist. The old man, his face tight with pain. He heard them too. "They're not real," he echoed, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The voices didn't stop. They just kept screaming. And then, through the chaos, one voice broke through. My own. "Please," it begged. "Please help me." My stomach twisted violently. My hands shook. I turned to the old man, my breath catching in my throat. "It sounds like me," I whispered. The old man's expression was unreadable, but his grip on the fire poker tightened. Outside, my voice screamed again. And then, from directly outside the door, a single deafening knock. The knock echoed through the cabin, a deep resonant boom that rattled the walls. The fire flickered violently, sending jagged shadows skittering across the wooden floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, like it knew we were listening. The old man's grip on the fire poker tightened, until his knuckles turned white. His face was set like stone, but I could see the tension in his posture, the barely concealed fear lurking beneath his hardened exterior. "Don't move," he whispered. I didn't plan to. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in around us, suffocating. My heart pounded so violently, I thought it might shake my entire body. I clenched my fists, trying to ground myself, trying to focus on anything but the thing that stood just outside that door. Then it spoke. My voice. "Let me in." It was exactly like me. Same tone, same inflection. It wasn't distorted or garbled like before. It sounded like I was standing right outside. I squeezed my eyes shut. The old man didn't react. He just stood there, breathing slowly, gripping his weapon like he was waiting for something. Then, another voice joined in. The old man's. "Open the door," it said softly. "We're freezing out here." I felt him tense beside me. His breathing changed, just a fraction, a small, almost imperceptible shift. But I noticed, he wasn't just afraid. He was tempted. I turned my head toward him, the blood rushing in my ears. "It's lying," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. His jaw clenched. The wind outside shrieked, rattling the walls, making the wooden beams groan like something ancient and alive. The fire dimmed again, the warmth retreating, as if the very cabin was being drained of life. Another knock, louder this time, more demanding, a whisper, just behind the wood. "I know you can hear me." The old man exhaled sharply, stepping back toward the fireplace. He threw another log onto the embers, and the flames flared up, casting deep orange light against the walls. He turned to me, his expression tight. "It's trying to break us," he said. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. "What happens if we open the door?" His face darkened. "You don't want to know." Another knock, more forceful. A deep, rattling growl slithered through the cracks in the cabin walls. Then, something scratched at the door, not a gentle scrape like before. This was claws, digging in, tearing at the wood. The old man took a sharp breath. He turned toward the window, his body tense. I followed his gaze, my pulse hammering. The frost-covered glass had begun to darken. Something massive was outside. Its shadow loomed, stretching across the window. At first it looked like an animal, something hunched and unnatural. But then it moved, jerky, disjointed. Its limbs were too long, its posture wrong, and its eyes, two hollow pits of darkness, peering through the glass. I felt a sharp, involuntary tremor run down my spine. The scratching at the door became frantic. The wood groaned, splintering. The voices outside began laughing, deep, guttural chuckles, low, rasping imitations of human laughter. It was enjoying this. I turned to the old man, my voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" His face was grim. "We hold out until dawn." I stared at him. "That's it." He gave a slow nod. "It won't come inside. Not unless we invite it. The growling outside deepened. The door shook, rattling in its frame. We had hours until sunrise, and I wasn't sure the cabin would hold. The walls trembled with each impact, the door groaning under the weight of whatever was outside. The laughter had stopped. Now there was only breathing, slow rattling, inhuman. The sound filled the cabin, pressing against my skull, making my skin crawl. The old man moved toward the fire, grabbing another log and shoving it into the flames. The fire flared up, filling the room with a momentary burst of warmth and light, but it did nothing to chase away the cold knot of fear coiling in my stomach. I stepped back, my breath shallow. If it can't come in, why is it still trying? The old man didn't look at me. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the burning wood. Because it knows fear makes people stupid. I swallowed, my throat dry. What do you mean? He turned then, his face lined with something heavier than just fear. I've seen it before, he murmured. It waits, it wears you down. It knows you'll make a mistake sooner or later. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. Another thud rattled the cabin. The door buckled slightly, the wood splintering near the frame. A deep guttural growl rumbled through the air, so low I could feel it in my bones. It was getting angry. The old man moved quickly, grabbing a thick metal poker from beside the fireplace and shoving it into my hands. If it gets inside, you fight. My fingers tightened around the rough iron, my heart hammering. You just said it couldn't get in. He exhaled sharply. It shouldn't, but I've seen nights where the rules don't hold. A chill spread through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Something scraped along the cabin walls, slow and deliberate, like nails against flesh. My stomach twisted as I realized. It was circling us. The footsteps were light, almost graceful, not rushed, not desperate. It knew it had time. The old man sucked in a sharp breath, his hands curling into fists. It's trying to make us feel trapped. I shuddered. Aren't we? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the table and grabbed a small rusted hunting knife, gripping it tightly. We don't speak to it, he muttered. We don't look it in the eye. Another thud against the walls. The wind outside had died down, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. No more howling gusts, no more rustling trees, only silence. And then, a voice. Not outside, inside. Why are you hiding? I whirled around, my chest seizing. The firelight flickered wildly, casting shadows across the cabin walls. But we were alone. The voice had come from behind me. The old man's face was pale, his lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Then, from the opposite side of the room, another voice. My fire's going out, it whispered, a breathy rasping sound, so close I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I spun, swinging the iron poker blindly. It whistled through empty air. Laughter, low, croaking. It was inside. I staggered backward, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with something rotten, something wrong. The fire dimmed again. The room seemed to stretch, the walls pulling away, the darkness pressing in. Then, from the corner, a shape, tall, gaunt, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its mouth was wide, too wide, lips stretched over jagged, uneven teeth. Its hollow black eyes gleamed in the firelight, locked onto mine. It had no breath, no movement, but I felt it looking at me. And then, it smiled. Not a human smile, not an expression of warmth or kindness. A predator's grin. A shiver rolled through my body, and I gripped the poker tighter, my palms slick with sweat. The old man spoke then, his voice shaking. Don't look at it. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. The thing took a single slow step forward. The firelight flickered over its skin, pale, stretched too tight over bones that jutted unnaturally beneath the surface. Then it spoke, opened the door. The voice that came out of its mouth was mine. I sucked in a breath, my hands shaking so hard, the iron poker nearly slipped from my grasp. The old man grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. Look away. I forced my gaze to the fire, my heart slamming against my ribs. The air around us had turned ice cold. My skin prickled with something unseen, something pressing against me from all sides. The thing took another step. I clenched my jaw, my body rigid. I could feel it staring, feel it waiting. Then, it laughed and vanished. The fire roared back to life. The warmth flooded the cabin, chasing away the cold in an instant. The weight in the air lifted, the pressure around my chest loosening. I gasped, sucking in deep, shuddering breaths. The old man let go of my arm, his face lined with exhaustion. I turned, my stomach churning. The thing was gone. The cabin was silent, but outside, just beyond the door, a single quiet knock. The knock was softer this time, a gentle tap, almost polite, as if whatever stood outside knew we wouldn't open the door, but still wanted to remind us that it was there, that it was waiting. The old man stood frozen, his gaze locked onto the door. I could see his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths, his fingers still curled tightly around the hunting knife. I turned toward the fire, swallowing hard. My hands were shaking. My body was still trembling from the thing that had stood inside the cabin, from the moment its hollow black eyes had met mine. It had been real. It had spoken with my voice, and now it was outside again. Another knock, then silence. The old man took a slow step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. He reached for the iron poker I had dropped, and placed it carefully back near the fire. His eyes flickered toward me. "It's almost morning," he murmured. I blinked. My body was so flooded with fear that I hadn't realized how much time had passed. The storm outside had quieted. The howling wind was gone, and through the small frost-covered window, I could see the faintest sliver of gray light creeping through the trees. Dawn was coming. The old man exhaled, his posture easing just slightly. "It doesn't like the daylight," he said. "Once the sun is up, it will leave." A heavy breath escaped my chest, my limbs suddenly weak with relief. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to close my eyes and let sleep take me. But I knew better. Not yet. Another knock, softer this time. Then, a whisper, a woman's voice. "Please, I'm so cold." I shut my eyes. I didn't need to look at the old man to know he had heard it too. It was still trying, still hoping we would slip, make one final mistake before the sun crept over the horizon. I opened my mouth, about to say something, when the doorknob twisted. The old man lunged. Before I could even process what was happening, he grabbed the chair from the table and slammed it against the door, jamming it shut. The doorknob rattled violently, twisting back and forth, the wood groaning beneath the pressure. A low growl rumbled through the cabin, something deep and ancient. Then, the sound stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The old man didn't either. He just stood there, his hands gripping the back of the chair, his head tilted slightly toward the door, as if he were listening for something. Then, a distant howl echoed through the trees. I flinched. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. And just like that, the presence outside was gone. The tension in the air snapped, like a string pulled too tight finally giving way. The old man exhaled sharply, stepping back from the door. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed his face. "It's over," he muttered. I stayed where I was, my body still locked in place, my mind trying to process the last few hours. It was gone. The cabin was warm again. The nightmare was over. The old man turned toward me. "You should leave as soon as the sun is up," he said quietly. "Follow the tree line south. You'll find a road." I hesitated. "You're staying?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "This is my home." I swallowed, glancing back at the door. Has it ever gotten anyone before? His expression darkened. He didn't answer. I didn't press. I stayed awake until the sun fully rose, casting golden light over the snow-covered forest. When I finally stepped outside, I was met with a stillness so unnatural that it made my skin crawl. There were no footprints in the snow. Nothing. As if nothing had ever been there at all. I turned back toward the cabin one last time. The old man stood in the doorway, watching me, his face unreadable. "Don't come back," he said. I nodded. Then I left. I followed his directions, my legs weak but determined. After about an hour, I found the road just as he had said, and by some miracle, a passing truck stopped for me. The driver looked at me like I was half frozen to death. Maybe I was. I never told anyone what happened. I never looked up the area. Never tried to find the cabin again. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear the voice, soft, whispering, calling my name. I had been driving for hours, the dark highway stretching endlessly before me. The GPS had long since lost signal, leaving me with nothing but my headlights and the barely visible road signs to guide me. This was supposed to be a quick trip, just a weekend away at a remote cabin to clear my head. Some solitude, some peace. But now, I was lost. The last sign I had passed had been rusted and unreadable. No mile markers, no familiar landmarks, just dense trees pressing in from both sides, their bare branches clawing at the sky. My gas tank was dipping dangerously low. I exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. There has to be a turnoff somewhere. Then, a figure, standing at the edge of the road. My heart lurched, my foot slamming onto the brake. The tires screeched against the pavement as my car skidded slightly before coming to a stop. The figure hadn't moved. A woman, she stood just beyond the reach of my headlights, her face obscured by the shadows. She was wearing a pale dress, her long dark hair hanging over her shoulders, her arms limp at her sides. For a long moment, we both just stood there, me in my car, her at the edge of the trees. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed down a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. A chill slithered down my spine. I should drive. I should leave her there, keep moving, ignore this entirely. But my hands wouldn't move from the wheel. Something about her compelled me, against every instinct screaming at me to turn around. I eased my foot off the brake and pulled onto the dirt road. The woman didn't follow. She just watched, as if she had been waiting for me to take this path. The trees closed in on either side, the road uneven beneath my tires. My headlights illuminated nothing but endless branches, the shadows growing darker, heavier, wrong. And then, my engine sputtered. I swore under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. The gas gauge had plummeted to empty. The car slowed, then died completely. Silence. I sat there, gripping the wheel so hard, my knuckles ached. The trees around me felt impossibly dense, the darkness stretching too far, swallowing the world whole. And then, the knocking started, soft, rhythmic, coming from inside my trunk. I froze. The knocking was soft at first, just a gentle tapping against the inside of my trunk. Slow, rhythmic, almost patient. Then, it got louder. I twisted in my seat, my breath caught in my throat. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but darkness. No movement, no shape behind me. Thump, thump, thump. I swallowed hard, my fingers digging into the steering wheel. There shouldn't be anything in my trunk. I hadn't packed much for the trip, just a duffel bag and some food. But now something was in there. I reached for my phone. No signal, of course. The knocking stopped. Silence pressed against my ears. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a whisper. Not from inside the car. Not from the trunk. From the trees. I turned my head slowly. The woods were suffocatingly dark. The gaps between the trees too deep, like looking into something endless. The wind had stopped. Even the insects had gone silent. But I wasn't alone. Somewhere just beyond the tree line, something was there, watching, waiting. I didn't see it, not at first. But then, a glimmer, a slight shift in the darkness, like something was moving without actually stepping forward. A shape, tall, wrong, too thin. Its limbs seemed off, its body slightly hunched. It stood between the trees, blending too perfectly into the shadows, and it was staring at me. My stomach twisted. I need to get out of here. My hands fumbled for the keys, twisting them desperately. The engine groaned but wouldn't turn over. Dead. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I forced myself to stay calm. I needed a plan. I needed to thump the trunk. My chest tightened. The thing in the trees still hadn't moved, but I felt it grinning. A voice drifted through the still air. Not loud, not a whisper, just, there. You should open it. I clamped my hands over my ears, my entire body trembling. I hadn't seen its mouth move, hadn't seen any mouth at all, but I had heard it, and the knocking had started again. Faster, harder, desperate. Something in my trunk was begging to get out. I had two choices: stay in the car, trapped, helpless, or open the trunk and see what was inside. My hands trembled against the keys. The knocking from the trunk had turned frantic. Thump, 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 thump. Like something trapped inside was slamming against the metal with all its strength. But the thing in the trees, it hadn't moved. Not forward, not back. Just standing there, its thin body barely distinguishable from the shadows, watching. And it had spoken. I knew I had heard it. That voice, low, smooth, and human, had slipped through the stillness of the forest like a blade. You should open it. I didn't want to. I couldn't, but I also couldn't stay here. I had no cell service. My car was dead, and something was waiting for me to make a choice. Slowly, my fingers reached for the door handle. The moment I pulled it, the wind started again, a sudden violent gust that sent a chill rushing through the air. The trees groaned, the branches twisted above me, moving in ways they shouldn't, bending as if something else was controlling them. I stepped out. The dirt beneath my feet felt softer than it should have, like the ground itself was shifting beneath me. The cold night air wrapped around me like invisible hands, pressing against my skin. I turned toward the trunk. The knocking stopped. My stomach twisted. I reached out, hesitant, terrified, my fingers brushing against the latch. The metal was cold, freezing, almost burning against my skin. I took a deep breath, and I opened it. The trunk lid flew up with a soft creak. My blood went cold. Inside, a man, curled into a tight ball, his body contorted in an unnatural position, his limbs bent at angles that made my stomach churn. His skin was pale, his clothes ragged, and his face, oh God, his face, wide, bloodshot eyes, lips cracked and dry, pulled into a silent scream. His entire body twitched, his fingers curled into rigid claws, and when he looked at me, his mouth opened. A hoarse, broken sound scraped from his throat. His lips moved, but at first, no words came out, just a deep, shuddering breath, like he had been waiting to speak. Then, they put me in here. My breath caught. I took a step back, my entire body trembling. My mind screamed at me to run, to slam the trunk shut and pretend I had never seen him. But I couldn't move. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps. His body twitched violently, his hands shaking, and then slowly, so slowly, his eyes flickered behind me, toward the trees. I swallowed hard. I knew what he was looking at. The thing. I turned my head, my breath shuddering in my throat. The figure was gone. The trees swayed in the wind, empty now. Nothing watching, nothing visible. But I knew it was still there, waiting. The man in the trunk tried to move, his body spasming as he grabbed my arm with surprising force. His grip was ice cold, his fingernails digging into my skin. His voice was barely above a whisper. You need to run. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran blindly into the forest, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my feet stumbling over uneven ground. Branches clawed at my arms. My legs burned with every frantic step, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, I heard the trunk slam shut. Not by me, not by him, by something else. I didn't look back. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, swallowing the road, the car, everything. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. Then the whispers started, not from one place, from everywhere. Soft voices drifting through the trees, curling into my ears, slipping into my mind like fingers pressing against my skull. Come back. You were never supposed to leave. You were meant to stay. The ground beneath me felt wrong. Not solid, not real, like I was running over something alive. Then, a hand grabbed my ankle. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from my lungs. I twisted, kicking wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the forest, just the dark. But my ankle still ached. the cold sensation of fingers lingering on my skin. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The whispers had stopped. The forest was silent. And then, from the darkness, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I backed away, my hands shaking, my eyes darting in every direction. The trees pressed in on me, their twisted limbs reaching downward, casting jagged shadows over the ground. And then I saw it. Not ahead of me, not behind me, but above me, perched in the trees. A figure, long and thin, its limbs too long, its body folded into itself like a broken marionette. It clung to the branches without effort, its faceless head tilted slightly, watching, waiting. I took a step back, my breath shuddering in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The thing unfolded, its arms stretched first, then its legs, its joints cracked as it moved, disjointed and unnatural, like something learning to walk for the first time. It dropped from the tree and landed without a sound. The whispers returned, a chorus of voices sliding through the air, curling around me like smoke. You should have stayed in the car. The thing took a step forward. I turned and ran, but this time I knew there was nowhere left to go. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached with every frantic step. But no matter how far I went, the forest never seemed to end. The trees stretched endlessly, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers, the air thick with a stillness that felt wrong. And the thing, it was following me, not running, not chasing, just moving. It was always just out of sight, slipping between the trees, its twisted limbs folding and unfolding unnaturally. As it kept pace with me, the whispers hadn't stopped either. They were inside my head now. Come back. You were meant to stay. You don't belong out here. The voices weren't just coming from the trees anymore. They were coming from below me, from above me, from inside my own thoughts, threading their way through my mind, erasing everything else. I needed to get out. I needed to wake up, because this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I spotted a break in the trees up ahead, a clearing. I pushed my legs harder, stumbling toward it, my body screaming in protest. If I could just reach open space, maybe I could get my bearings. Maybe I could see where I was. I burst into the clearing and nearly collapsed in horror. It wasn't a clearing. It was a road, the same one I had been driving on before. My car sat in the middle of it, engine dead, trunk still closed. The dirt path leading into the woods was just as I had left it, the tire tracks still fresh. I had been running in circles, my stomach twisted violently. This wasn't possible. I had run straight, hadn't I? My legs trembled as I staggered toward my car, my fingers fumbling for the door handle. My body screamed at me to get inside, to shut the door, to lock myself in. I yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands trembled as I reached for the keys. Still in the ignition, I twisted them desperately. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, my mind racing. Then, a sound, a low creak, from the trunk. My breath hitched, my hands went numb. The metal groaned as if something inside was shifting, something that hadn't been there before. I turned my head slowly, my body ice cold with terror. The trunk lid was still closed, but the thing in the woods was gone. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my skull. The whispers had stopped. The trees were silent. Something had changed. Then, the trunk clicked, the latch released on its own, the lid popping open just an inch. The forest seemed to exhale. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The man had been inside there before, but something told me, whatever was in there now wasn't him. The lid creaked, lifting slowly, and from inside, a voice. Not a whisper. Not human. Not alive. Why did you run? I lunged for the door handle, but the moment my fingers touched it, a hand shot out of the trunk. Long, thin, wrong. It grabbed my wrist, ice-cold fingers digging into my skin, pulling me backward with impossible strength. I screamed, twisting, thrashing, my free hand slamming against the dashboard. My foot hit the pedals wildly, but the car remained dead. The hand tightened. I was losing. Then the headlights turned on. Bright, blinding light flooded the trees. The thing recoiled, hissing, its grip loosening just enough for me to yank my arm free. I scrambled out of the car, stumbling forward, my body shaking violently. The trunk slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The whispers returned, soft and taunting. "You can't leave." The road stretched before me. But now, I could see something else, further down the road, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. The woman, the one in the pale dress, the one who had been standing at the roadside when this all started. She was still there, still watching, but this time she wasn't pointing toward the dirt path. She was pointing behind me, back toward the car, back toward the trunk. And when I turned, the lid was open again, and this time, I saw what was inside, and I finally understood. The trunk was open, not just slightly, not like before. It was wide open, revealing the impossible darkness inside. A darkness that seemed deeper than it should be, stretching further than the limits of my car, like a hole that had no bottom. And inside, I saw myself, my own body, twisted and pale, crammed into the trunk at an unnatural angle. My limbs bent the wrong way, my mouth frozen in an expression of pure terror. My eyes, wide, bloodshot, staring blankly at the ceiling of the trunk, were my own. But I was standing right here. A cold wave of horror crashed over me, my body locking up. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, my corpse twitched. Its fingers spasmed, its jaw clenched slightly, and then, slowly, its head turned toward me. The same face, the same eyes, and then it spoke. A broken whisper, hoarse and rasping. "You took too long." I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. My own voice, coming from inside that thing, rattled in my skull, making my stomach twist violently. This was wrong, so wrong. I turned my head, searching for the woman in the pale dress. She was still there, but now, she was shaking her head, slowly, deliberately. And then she whispered, "You're already in the trunk." A sickening realization slammed into me. I looked back. The body in the trunk was gone. And the car. It wasn't my car anymore. The headlights had dimmed. The windshield was cracked. The metal was rusted, old, decayed, as if it had been sitting there for years. The trees around it were different, warped, taller than before, twisting toward the sky, like grotesque fingers. This wasn't where I had started. This wasn't my reality anymore. I was in its place now. The whispers surged again, louder this time, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. "You never left. You never made it out. You took too long." I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Something was holding me there. And then, a hand grabbed my shoulder, ice cold, familiar. I didn't have to turn around. I already knew what was behind me. Myself, the thing that had crawled out of the trunk, the thing that had replaced me. Its breath was warm against my ear, even as its fingers tightened around my shoulder, locking me in place. And then, a soft whisper, not in my voice, not in any human voice, "Back where you belong." The world shifted, a sharp pull, like my body was being yanked backward, sucked into something deep, endless, dark. And then, silence. They found my car, a week later, abandoned. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no prints, just the car, rusted and decayed beyond its years, as if it had been sitting there for decades. They never found me, but sometimes, travelers on that same road report strange things. A man standing by the side of the highway, waving them down, begging for help. But when they stop, there's no one there, just an empty road, and an open trunk, waiting.